Alright guys, so this is the third video on the return of the heroes, the second video detailing Odysseus's many misfortunes on his way home. So we have just been to the underworld where Odysseus has met Achilles, Agamemnon, his own mother, Ajax, and his recently departed comrade Elpenor, who asks him to give him a proper burial, remember 3 handfuls of dirt, okay, and Odysseus agrees, and so now they are going to be returning to Aea, where they're going to get some additional warnings from Circe. So, at Elpenor's funeral, Circe warns Odysseus that the dangers of the singing creatures who lure men to their deaths on the rock around their island. They are called the Sirens. She advised him to avoid them, but said that if he really felt that he must listen, he should have his men plug their ears with beeswax and tie him to the mast to keep him from escaping. So, of course, Odysseus accepts the challenge. He tells his men to do this, and as they passed the island, the 3 sirens began to sing beautifully, promising him wisdom and knowledge of the past and future. Enchanted by their song, he struggles and tries to break free, but his men bound him even more tightly until they passed beyond the island. Some versions say that the sirens then drowned themselves when Odysseus passes through because they could not lure him to his death. Odysseus had also been told by Circe that he would have a choice between 2 paths home. One was the Wandering Rocks, which we saw in Jason and the Argonauts, and if with the Wandering Rocks, either all made it through or all died, and the only ones who had previously passed through the rocks was Jason, with Athena's help. Odysseus, however, chose the second path on the side of the strait where there was a monster named Charybdis, whose whirlpool would sink the ship, and whose on the other side was the monster Scylla, who had 6 heads and could seize and eat 6 men at a time. The advice was to sail close to Scylla and lose 6 men, but to not fight, lest they should lose more men. Odysseus did not dare tell his crew of the sacrifice, or they would have cowered below and not rowed, in which case all would have ended up in Charybdis. So 6 men duly died, and Odysseus said that the desperate cries of the wretched betrayed men were the worst thing he had ever known. Clearly this affected the morale of what was left of his crew, and the survivors began to feel mutinous. And this is where we get kind of the apex of the journey with the cattle of Helios. Finally, Odysseus and his crew, and his surviving crew, approach the island Thrinacia, which was sacred to Helios, and where Helios kept his sacred cattle. Odysseus, having been warned by Tiresias and Circe not to touch the cattle, told his men that they would not land there. However, they argued that they were mourning, and they refused to travel by night, and finally threatened mutiny. Outnumbered, Odysseus gives in, and the men were soon trapped on the island by adverse winds, and after their food stores ran out, they began to get hungry. Odysseus goes inland to pray for help and falls asleep. In his absence, his men reasoned that they might as well eat the cattle and be killed by the gods as die of starvation, and they claimed they would offer sacrifices and treasure to appease the gods if they returned alive to Ithaca. When they slaughtered the cattle, the guardians of the island, Helios's daughters, I'll spare you their names, don't have to worry about that, told their father, who then told Zeus that he would take the sun down to Hades, or to the underworld, if justice was not done. So when the when the ship pulled out to sea, a storm conjured by Zeus killed all the rest of the crew, and only Odysseus survives. The crewless ship was sucked into Charybdis, but Odysseus survives by clinging to an olive tree and floating below Scylla's cave. When Charybdis spat out the remains of his ship, he let go and landed on the keel, which drifted across the sea for 9 days, and on the 10th day, he washed up on an island. The island where he lands is the island of the nymph Calypso. The island's name is Ogygia, and Calypso is a daughter of Atlas who holds Odysseus captive as her lover for 7 years, promising immortality if he would only agree to stay. However, he doesn't, and he remains determined to get home to his wife. On behalf of Athena, Zeus finally intervenes and sends Hermes to tell Calypso to let him go. Odysseus winds up departing on a small raft furnished by Calypso with provisions of water, wine, and food, only to be hit by a storm sent by his old enemy, Poseidon. He winds up floating desolate near the land of the Phaeacians, and Athena makes the princess Nausicaa have, how can I put this? She enchants Nausicaa, that's a good way of putting it, to make Odysseus appear irresistible to her. So like a love spell. All right. So he is welcomed hospitably to the land of the Phaeacians, and a bard winds up singing a song about the Trojan War. Odysseus, since he has yet to be identified by the Phaeacians, begins to cry because he had, of course, been at Troy and he longed to return home. And it's at this point that Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, presses him for his true identity. And actually, I guess I got a little bit behind. Sorry about that. Nausicaa's dream, the discovery of Odysseus, and the hospitality of Alcinous and Areta. Sorry about that. Okay. After the recital, the Phaeacians offer him passage home with all the hoardings he attained along the way and the gifts the Phaeacians themselves bestowed upon him. Remember, this is an ideal form of hospitality. King Alcinous provided one of the fastest Phaeacian ships that carried Odysseus home to Ithaca. Poseidon, on seeing Odysseus's final return to Ithaca, was furious and decided to cast a ring of mountains around Scheria, or the Phaeacians' land, so that they could never sail again. This would have been very damaging to the Phaeacians because they were seafarers, so Zeus persuades Poseidon not to pursue with that idea. Instead, Zeus offers to turn this fastest ship, on which Odysseus journeyed home, to stone. And that's what they do. They turn this ship to stone. So, the very last part of Odysseus's adventures. So, 10 years after the fall of Troy, alone and on a stranger's ship, he finally returns to Ithaca. And what does he find? He finds that his wife Penelope has been besought by 106 suitors for her hand in marriage. These 106 suitors loiter about the palace, eat her food, drink her wine, and consort with her maidservants. That is certainly a way to win a woman over, right? Penelope was despondent about her husband's absence, especially due to the mystery of his fate. She kept thinking that he could come home at any time or never. She winds up fending the suitors off for years using stalling tactics that eventually begin to wear thin with her many suitors, And meanwhile, Odysseus's mother dies of grief, and his father, Laertes, winds up in poor health himself. So finally, being pressed by her suitors, this is the fidelity of Penelope, she tells the many suitors that she is weaving a robe for Laertes, her father-in-law, and that once she was finished with the robe, she would make her choice of a husband. So she would spend all day weaving the robe, and at the end of the day at night, she would undo all of her work. Eventually, these 106 suitors wise up to her deception, and they demand a decision. And it's luckily at this point that Odysseus finally returns home. When he returns to Ithaca alone, upon landing, he meets the goddess Athena, who disguises him as an old man, or perhaps a beggar, or maybe both. And in his disguise, he's welcomed by his old swineherd, which is a agricultural servant, Eumaeus, who did not recognize him, but nevertheless treated him well. His son, Telemachus, is just returning from a year of searching for information about his father, and so he was the first to know his father returned after Athena revealed Odysseus for who he was in front of him. Odysseus's faithful dog, Argos, was the second to recognize him. Aged and decrepit, this dog would be over 20 years old, right? Aged and decrepit, the animal did its best to wag its tail, but Odysseus does not want to be found out and had to maintain his cover. So actually, the dog recognized him before his disguise was lifted, okay? So the weary dog dies in peace, happy to have seen his master once again. Oh, that part always makes me sad. The second human to recognize him was his old wet nurse, who knew him well enough to see through his rags and recognized an old scar on his leg, which he received while hunting boar earlier in his life. And of course, Eumaeus was also in there as well. He was the servant, remember, that welcomed him first. When Odysseus arrives at his house disguised as an old man or a beggar, he sits in his hall where he observes the suitors and where he was repeatedly humiliated and insulted by them. That will take us to our last bit. The heroic trial of the bow and axes. So, in his disguise, Odysseus goes to Penelope and tells her that he had met Odysseus, and he spins this brave and haughty tale about his bravery in battle. Penelope, still ignorant of this beggar's identity, begins to cry. She went to the suitors and tells them that whoever could string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe handles would marry her. This was Odysseus's advantage, as only he could string his bow. It's believed that his bow was a composite, requiring great skill and leverage to string rather than brute strength. Penelope then announced what he, as the beggar, had told her. The suitors each tried to string the bow, but their attempts were in vain. So, just to clarify, that might not have been clear, Odysseus comes up with this trial idea and he sells it to Penelope. Okay? So all the suitors try, but they cannot string the bow. Odysseus then takes it, strings it, lines up the 12 axe handles, and shoots an arrow through all 12. This you can see in the little picture here of what that would look like. It is kind of interesting. I don't remember the name of the company, but there is a film production company that uses this type of imagery as their trademark, right? It's like their trademark imagery. At the beginning of a movie, it shows this arrow through 12 axe handles. That's like my nerd moment. I got excited when I saw that the first time. Okay, so he shoots an arrow through all 12 axe handles, and Athena finally takes off his disguise and reveals Odysseus, and with the help of his son and his servants that have already recognized him, he slaughters all of the suitors. The first suitor that he kills, takes an arrow to the throat while drinking in the great hall. And Odysseus uses arrows at first, but he eventually runs short and he kills the remaining suitors with spears. Caught by surprise and deprived of arms, thanks to Telemachus the son, who's collected them, the suitors are at a distinct disadvantage and were only able to arm themselves after it was too late. So the motif of recognition we can see has played out in this particular part of the story several times. We'll see it, next with Odysseus and his wife Penelope. All right, but we also see it with the wet nurse Euryclea, with his son, and with Eumenes, the swineherd. So the motif of recognition, Penelope and Laertes. His wife and his father is all that's left. Penelope, still not certain that the beggar was indeed her husband, decides to test him. She orders her maid to make up Odysseus's bed and move it from their bedchamber into the hall outside his room. Odysseus is furious when he hears this because one of the bedposts is made from a living olive tree. He himself had designed it this way, and it could not be moved unless by a god. He told her this, and since only he and she knew of it, she accepted that he was indeed her husband. She comes running to him, hoping that he would forgive her, and he does, firstly because he could understand why she had tested him, and secondly because he had passed the test. And it's at this point as well where Laertes, the father, is also reunited with his son. So the very end of the story goes like this, right? The end of the Odyssey itself ends with the reunion of Penelope and Odysseus. And in fact, Athena helps in this happy reunion by holding back the dawn so that they can have a longer night to talk. Yeah, talk. I'm sure that's what they were doing. Okay, sorry. That's a funnier joke in class. Anyway, the subsequent fate and death of Odysseus is not depicted in the Odyssey. Homer does not get into that. He ends with a happy ending. But later in life, Odysseus follows the prophecy of Tiresias, and he plants an oar as a monument to Poseidon. At the very end of his life, he is accidentally killed by his son with Circe. Okay, so his son with Circe comes to Ithaca to try to find Odysseus, his father, right? But he ends up accidentally killing his father, and so I don't know about that part about the peaceful death away from the sea, but that's the version of the story that we're left with that Homer didn't feel like he needed to give us. So maybe Homer would have had it end differently. All right, guys, that is the end of our many adventures in Greek mythology. And if you've stuck it out and you've made it through this last video, I just want to say how very grateful I am to have had you guys as students. You've been a great group. I am so disappointed that we didn't get to finish the semester off in person, but you guys will always be one of my favorite groups of students. And I hope that you have had a good time in the class, even if these last couple of weeks have been kind of a struggle. All right. Good luck on the final exam.